Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief. Before we get started on today's big picture interview, just a quick reminder that you can make sure you don't miss a single episode of Trendlines by subscribing to it on iTunes, Spotify, or the podcast app of your choice. Over the past 4 years, American politics has been consumed and subsumed by one man, Donald Trump. Since his election in 2016, Trump's disregard for convention has upended the norms of the U.S. presidency and undermined the separation of powers on which America's constitutional system depends. Meanwhile, his iconoclastic approach to foreign policy has further frayed the global order the U.S. has historically used to advance its interests and raised questions about America's commitment and dependability as an ally. Long-standing political partisanship and divisions within the U.S. have become particularly acute in the run-up to next week's election, amid heightened anxiety on both sides over the potential for tampering and manipulation of the outcome. In today's Big Picture Trendlines interview, I'm joined by Edward Luce to discuss the impact of Trump's 4 years in office, the atmosphere surrounding next week's election, and what's at stake for America and the world. Ed is a columnist and the U.S. national editor for the Financial Times, and he's long been a highly regarded observer of American politics, which he's been covering for FT since 2006. Ed, thanks so much for joining us on Trendlines.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Judah.
Before we take a look at the current election, the 2020 election next week, I thought it might make sense to just look backward a little bit to 2016 and Donald Trump's election in that year and his presidency since then, just to get a sense of your takeaways from the election and from his presidency in terms of some of the political divisions in the U.S., the health of American institutions, and what Donald Trump's presidency has revealed to you about the cohesion, national cohesion in the U.S.
That's a big question. I mean, I guess I would start with the premise that America's polarization and the decay of its federal institutions did not begin with Trump, and in some respects, Trump is a product of that climate. Or, you know, as the cliche goes, he's a cure worse than the disease. But the disease pre-exists and pre-existed Trump, and he has gone about exploiting those divisions to the hilt. And I think perhaps what's been most revelatory about Trump is his own psychology rather than the macro environment around him. And his own psychology is, at some level, sort of almost diabolically skilled at seeking out people's weaknesses and their resentments and harvesting those for his own political ends. But at another level, his psychology is self-destructive, because there are things he could have done that would, I think, have maximized his chances of being reelected, and he just can't do them. He can't bring himself to do them. And they chiefly involve working across the aisle, getting an infrastructure bill passed, focusing on the forgotten American, redeeming those sides of the 2016 platform he ran on, and he just hasn't done any of that. And he is right up to the last minute of this campaign, you know, focusing on things like Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's alleged dementia, as well as alleged corruption, all of which are demonstrably bad for his poll numbers. But he that's the guy he is. He is, you know, the scorpion and the frog. That's who he is. That's his nature.
My father always says character is destiny. And it seems like you're saying that for Trump, that's the case. I take it too from what you're saying that in the symptom or cause debate, you come down more on the side of symptom than of cause.
Yes, although I think it's more complicated than that. You know, I think this is a negative feedback loop. It's actually a positive feedback loop in that Trump is, you know, also exacerbating the causes of America's problems and political dysfunction, and that, as I wrote recently, even if he loses, Trumpism is going to live on, and that's a sort of whole different, more nuclear sort of layer of the polarization problem in America that Biden would have to deal with. That I think is worse than the Tea Party Obama had to deal with, or the vast right-wing conspiracy, inverted commas, that Hillary Clinton claimed was against her husband. So I do think it gets more difficult. It gets more irredentist. It gets more overtly racial in some ways, and that, of course, makes it less pliable to compromise, reason, to all the sorts of things that this system is predicated on. It doesn't work unless there's some cross-party cooperation, and I think Trump will leave the Republican Party, if indeed he leaves politics. He will leave the Republican Party in a far less compromising and pragmatic frame of mind than when he found it. And he found it in a pretty uncompromising, unpragmatic frame of mind.
So in the event he loses, you don't anticipate a period of self-reflection for the Republican Party to figure out where it went wrong, but more of a doubling down.
I do, yes. And I think that, if you look at the composition of elected Republicans in Washington, but also in state legislatures, they're considerably more to the right, more prone to nativism than the ones that were in office in 2016. What remained of the sort of Northeastern Rockefeller type Republican and some of the more moderate types in other parts of the country, they've pretty much disappeared. There are a handful here and there, but this is far more Trump's party now than it was then. Remember then, the first elected Republican to endorse him was Jeff Sessions, and that was way into 2016. In 2020, pretty much every single one before the year began had endorsed him. They're his people now.
Now, with regard to the question of whether Trump is a budding dictator, an existential threat to U.S. democracy, obviously another 4 years of Trump would have dramatic implications on that question. But in terms of what you've seen over the past 4 years, do you feel that those kind of fears have been overblown, or do you think they're justified?
A combination. I think that the opposition to Trump outside of politics, in terms of civil society, in terms of the media, in terms of parts of the judiciary, have been fairly robust. There's nothing about Trump other than his full tax returns that we don't know, and I guess his ultimate creditors that we don't know. And there are democracies that have become illiberal democracies, like India, where civil society and the media isn't really able to do that. So I think, America's less weak in terms of its guardrails than other democracies, which isn't to say that these guardrails have not weakened. The trajectory is the wrong direction. Trump's takeover of the judiciary is going to be with us for decades. And the breaking of norms, the shattering of norms in Washington, D.C., I think sets very dangerous precedents for how future presidents are going to behave. And I would be completely lacking in confidence to predict that we're not going to get another Trump, but perhaps a more effective, a more competent, a less psychologically complicated version, a less idiosyncratic Trump in 2024 or 2028. And so I don't believe even a significant Biden victory would end this problem. It's going to provide a much welcome pause and an opportunity for the Democratic Party and conservatives who are lost from the Republican Party to try and rebuild these institutions and trust in them. But it's not an easy thing to do.
What, when you look back at the past 4 years in American politics, what to you was the most surprising thing?
That's a good question. I guess it's the vehemence with which a lot of former Republicans, never Trumpers, and I guess many of them hope to be future Republicans, it's the vehemence with which they've opposed Trump. And I think what triggered them was a person who avowedly doesn't think America stands above any other country. That, like Putin, we're not so innocent, right? We interfere in other democracies. We've had people killed, and I think that deeply offended a sense of American exceptionalism, particularly amongst foreign policy communities in Washington, D.C., almost all of which is with Biden, and the effectiveness of those never Trumpers. So the Lincoln Project has been really much better than the DNC or liberal groups at trolling Trump, at really provoking him, and at sort of crafting these advertisements and these little 2-minute pieces that are meant to get under Trump's skin and succeed. And I mention that because I would have thought, in early 2017, that the opposition to Trump, the most effective opposition to Trump, would come from the left, but it doesn't really. It comes from angrily disappointed conservatives, particularly foreign policy conservatives.
What in the past 4 years of American politics has been the most depressing feature to you?
It's the normalization of all of this. So you have this term, Trump derangement syndrome, which I understand. Some people are obsessed just with Trump rather than the sort of longer march of the Republican Party. And I think you could level that charge against, some of the Lincoln Project people, is that, look, this isn't a jack-in-the-box phenomenon. You've seen this since at least Newt Gingrich. This Trump is a sort of, in a way, a logical culmination of where the party and the conservative movement has been going. But the sense that people get switched off whenever you focus on whatever outrageous sort of Goebbels-esque lie Trump is coming out with, people have somehow desensitized to it and acclimatized to it. Now, that disappointment that sort of I've felt with the numbing of popular opinion to Trump might be belied by a strong turnout next Tuesday and by a comprehensive rebuke at the polls. But I think it's still going to be true that even if you get a relatively high turnout election, it's say 60% would be pretty high by historic standards. You'd therefore get maybe 33% of America voting against Trump, and the rest would either not be voting or voting for him. That to me is a level of apathy that is worrying. And, I see no signs of changing.
We could go through the whole panoply of emotions, but I'll limit it to one more. What for you in the past 4 years has been the most hopeful development or sign?
That's, I suppose, partly the role of the media, and maybe that's a very parochial answer to give you, since I'm, in the media. But I think that the role of the media and its viability in commercial terms, that it's sustainable, is quite a hopeful sign. I mean, I always sort of quote that Jefferson line that it's more important to have a free press than it is to have a government. And I don't literally believe that that's true. I think you need both. But the existential sort of fear about the death of the conventional media has I think been overblown. And if Trump in a way has been he's been a sort of what's the word for it when you basically give a lot of free money. He's been a fed program for the media, and of course, the disappearance of Trump may be equally bad, but there is a demand there for non-alternative facts as well as for alternative facts. In the famous, to paraphrase Kellyanne Conway's famous phrase.
So you feel the press did a good job of covering Trump. Do you feel that the press ever got a little too drawn into the whole spectacle that he creates around himself?
Yes, although it's impossible to avoid. I mean, so take the coronavirus briefings that he started to give daily in April, May. These were sort of catastrophic in terms of managing public behavior with COVID, and in terms of his trashing of social distancing protocols and so forth. And therefore, you could say it was irresponsible to give him that platform and to allow him to pretend these were scientific briefings rather than political advertisements. On the other hand, this is the president, this is the commander-in-chief of the world's richest democracy, and the spectacle is entirely relevant. I have to say, what served Trump in 2016, which was pretty much free media airtime, his earned media, as it's defined, was worth billions of dollars in what the cable and networks gave him, has actually turned against him in 2020, that the more he talks, the worse he does. So I don't think that's the motive for the media covering him and covering his rallies. But I do think that there's an arc there which is quite interesting, which is saturation ultimately has been looks like being part of his undoing.
At the risk of sounding frivolous, there's always been a very entertainment aspect of Trump as a politician, very much a performer. And throughout his presidency, there's also that almost fascination, the train wreck fascination, to see if he's going to go off the rails, and almost being unable to avert your gaze. Is that fascination and that entertaining aspect, is that something that you felt personally covering politics in Washington over the last 4 years? And how did that complicate the task of actually covering what's going on?
There's a sickly horror to watching Trump. It's hard to tear yourself away, although, as I say, it's easier and easier as time goes on. So he's not an addictive drug. He's a sort of a drug that declines with overuse. I guess as the focal point of everything, which is a great skill he has, to inject himself into every conversation and become the story in for every issue in the country. I guess that does complicate how you view the world. It cartoonizes things, and it simplifies them, and yet it's hard to get past it because you can't ignore it. So you're always caught in a dilemma. I think the trick that I've tried, the method that I have sort of attempted, and many colleagues have attempted through journalism, is to use him as a link to sort of the larger issues that help get him elected, which are still there. The problems that he was elected to solve in his mind, or in the mind of many people who voted for him, are still there. And in some cases, he's made them considerably worse. You've got to keep sort of linking back to that broader sociological reality in America, which is not a cartoon, and which doesn't begin and end with Trump.
You mentioned that you don't think Trumpism will disappear should Trump lose. and that you expect that in the event he loses in 2024, 2028, there will be almost a more effective version. Do you think any of the potential successors, some of whom have been speculated about, Mike Pompeo, for instance, and others, do you think they could exercise the same sort of attraction and mobilize the political base that Trump has ridden in the same way? Or is there something sui generis about Trump and that bond that he's created with his political base?
I think there is undoubtedly something sui generis about Trump. And it'll be very hard for anybody to replicate it, Cotton, Hawley, Pompeo. You might equally well get a reversion to what nowadays would be considered the middle of the Republican Party, which would be Nikki Haley, or somebody of that ilk. Or you could get an even more cartoonish development in which, Trump himself tries to come back in 2024, or Donald Trump Jr., gets put up to inherit that sort of purely Trumpian mantle. It's very hard to predict. I think what you can say is that the party as a whole, the GOP, is clearly wedded to a combination of a form of Christian nativism on the one hand and serving plutocracy on the other. And that it's incredibly hard to see how it, unless it's obliterated, sort of Herbert Hoover style 1932 defeat, it's very hard to see how it reconstitutes itself as a moderate center-right party. The answer to 24 or 28 would, of course, partly depend on what the conditions in America are like and who the Democratic nominee was. If it's somebody like Kamala Harris versus somebody like Tom Cotton, you can see a very racialized election.
And genderized at that point as well. Turning a little bit to the Democratic Party, it's also had quite an interesting trajectory in terms of the battle between its more progressive wing and the more centrist Clintonian wing or Obama wing. How do you see that in terms of some of these broader dynamics in American politics, and also potentially for Joe Biden should he win in Tuesday's election?
I think it's going to be a very interesting, if he wins, it's going to be an incredibly interesting fissure that has been kept remarkably well contained during this general election, but which will, I think, open up quite visibly if Biden wins. There are very, very different Democratic parties. The overwhelming desire to defeat Trump has kept it in a sort of roughly visible single form up until now. The difference between the progressive left and base and the more centrist, if you like, corporatist party that Biden is more at home in, I think will come to a head very, very quickly over the kinds of reforms on the economy that he pushes through and what he does, how he responds when Republicans try to block those reforms, either through the filibuster or if they've retained control of the Senate in this election, then through simply refusing to meet in the middle. At which point, will Biden have radicalism thrust upon him, like some people in history have greatness thrust upon them? Will he allow himself to be radicalized by the circumstances to abolish or dilute the filibuster, to increase the number of U.S. states by making the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and other, as the left would want him to do? Or will he double down on this, look, let's all get along, what I call sort of Jason Donovan school of politics? And I don't really know the answer to that, but I do know that tension is going to be very visible. It's also there on foreign policy, quite strongly on foreign policy, that Biden, I think, is comfortable with what Ben Rhodes once defined as the blob. sort of roughly the consensus that comes from the Washington foreign policy establishment, which sees America sustaining its role as the global hegemon, maintaining its presence in the Pacific as well as in Europe, at whatever cost that takes, and with, of course, the potential always for a militarization of things, and with the implicit sort of militarization of diplomacy being the normal state of affairs. The progressive wing of the party do not see foreign policy that way. Any sort of realistic grasp of where America is in the world would suggest that relative decline is happening. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's partly a product of Pax Americana, if you like, that, you know, there is a global economy in which the developing world can participate and get richer. But an even more harsh and realistic reading would say there is some absolute decline going on. And that America is no longer, you know, automatically a model for other countries to follow, and that there is an ideological competition going on with China in which America is not always prevailing. No Democratic nominee, still less president, can afford to admit that in public. It would be politically, if not suicidal, very self-harming. But the left of the party do admit that and talk in those terms, and want America to recalibrate its foreign policy to accommodate the changing of circumstances. That's a very, very big division between, if you like, sort of exceptionalism as normal and a sort of new progressive realism. And I don't see that divide's going to be visible as quickly, but in a way it's an even deeper divide.
In terms of the hopes among Democrats, but also among some of those never Trumpers that you mentioned for a Biden presidency that sort of presides over a restoration of U.S. power, influence, its global role, based on a renewal at home. From what you're saying, you think that's going to be easier said than done?
I think it's not going to be the world that Biden left off in 2016, or that we all left off in 2016. I think that for the most part, China has been expanding its power and its reach and its influence around the world since then. And then during COVID, that's kind of accelerated. China will grow this year when the US and other Western economies are going to shrink. And so that the sort of relative gap between China and the West has narrowed more rapidly than you would have expected it to. Now, China also has been overplaying its hand and alienating neighbors and becoming fairly aggressive and robust in its regional foreign policy. And some of the Belt Road Initiative projects, have blown up in its face. It's not the public relations triumph that, China might have hoped it was. By and large, though, the world is different. It is a great power rivalry world in a way that, it was possible to deny during the Obama-Biden years. And of course, particularly during the Bush Jr. years. I think reality is catching up. And that, if there is one thing that the Trump administration, got right, it was defining America's foreign policy and defense priorities around great power competition. And it's a terribly hard reality for Americans to accept, particularly American foreign policy establishment to accept, because it goes against the narrative of American exceptionalism, which is deeply, deeply inbred.
I was going to reference one of your recent, if not your most recent column, was a qualified defense of Trump's foreign policy record. First of all, in terms of having delivered on promises that his 2016 voters had found compelling. And you also suggested or argued that in some ways his method and the way in which he broke norms and diplomatic niceties, doesn't really follow protocol, was somewhat central to getting messages across effectively, whether it was to allies in terms of burden sharing, and as you just mentioned now on China. At the same time, there was in a lot of obvious ways somewhat confused implementation of a lot of these initiatives. Assuming that Trump does win on Tuesday, what kind of message should America's allies and partners, but also adversaries, take from that? And what would you expect to see in terms of their reaction and adjustment to another 4 years of Trump?
I would expect a second Trump term to accelerate on your side of the Atlantic in Europe, discussions about integrated European defense policy and foreign policy. I don't think it's going to be very easy because of how divergent sort of national political cultures are in Europe. But I suspect this would be a moment of very harsh, cold reality that would accelerate that conversation. And you'd get similar in Asia. I mean, countries like Australia, are betting on the America they knew coming back. If they then, were forced to digest the fact that it isn't coming back, then I would expect there to be a lot more accommodation with China than they would like to ideally pursue. India, of course, would be a huge variable there. I don't think India is ever going to be in the state of mind to accommodate itself to Chinese hegemony. So we'd probably, you'd see India continuing down the same path, but perhaps doubling down in terms of upgrading its military and its nuclear arsenal. So you would, I think, get a sort of move towards the Oceanas of 1984. You would get a more Orwellian world in which regionalism, with regional with dominant regional powers in each region, the United States in North America, Europe, it would be Russia unless Europe got its act together, and increasingly China. And in Asia, of course, it would be China, but with India in competition. I think it would be a much, much less stable world. I don't believe that Trump is good for American foreign policy. And what I wrote wasn't, actually an endorsement of Trump. It was really a warning that if Trump does lose, America's foreign policy establishment is going to interpret that as a vote for them. And I don't think that will be a mandate they will have earned. And I am concerned that would then lead to a resumption of a more sort of unilateralist America. I don't mean one that indulges in wars of choice. I don't think Biden would be that kind of president, but one that doesn't recalibrate on a more realistic sort of scale America's place in the world.
So you wouldn't anticipate a Biden presidency being resorting to more multilateralism and a less domineering approach. You would see it more as more likely a return to some of the hubris and that led to some of the faulty decisions from the U.S. foreign policy establishment over the past couple decades.
I think the first few months of a Biden administration would look much more multilateralist than Trump. It would be hard not to. It would rejoin the WHO, the Paris Accords on climate change, COVAX, the vaccine initiative, and Biden, would get along with America's allies. So I think it would look and feel more multilateralist in the first few months. And those are sort of low-hanging fruit that I'm sure a President Biden would pluck. But I think the larger sort of questions, of how America copes with a changing world, and in particular how it deals with China, would be very much up for grabs. There isn't really a settled Biden-China policy. He hasn't been forced to really enunciate one on the campaign trail. He's quite sensibly allowed Trump to dominate, to take all the oxygen, and to point out, gently every now and then that we shouldn't call this the China virus. So there isn't actually a settled Biden-China policy. There is going to be a debate about what it should be. And I think that the hawks on the right, the Tom Cotton kinds, rather than the Rand Paul kinds, are going to be setting the tone to quite some degree. Of China as they see China as the new evil empire. And in fact, Cotton has used that exact phrase. And I think Biden's going to feel the pressure to be hawkish on China, and some of which might well be deserved. China is becoming an overweening power and a potential threat. So don't get me wrong. I'm not downplaying Xi Jinping's potential for nationalist militarism here. But equally, we shouldn't overplay the ability of America to blunder into a confrontation with China that would benefit nobody, and that could, at its worst sort of level, be disastrous. So it's going to be very difficult for Biden to develop a clear China policy, given the atmosphere in Washington.
Now, if I've done my math correctly, this is the fourth U.S. election that you'll have covered for the Financial Times. How would you compare the climate surrounding this election campaign, which is getting into the last frenetic days, to the previous ones you've covered?
So the first one I covered was 2008, although I was here for the 2000 campaign, the famous Florida hanging Chad one. First one I covered was 2008, was obviously a sort of one of a kind campaign. It was the Obama rise. There was an incredible sort of sense of euphoria about putting the post 9/11 Iraq War years behind America, not just in the general election, but in the primaries with Obama's defeat of Hillary, and chiefly because she voted for the Iraq War. So the difference between 2008 and 2020 really is night and day. The level of mistrust and of mutual contempt, I think, just in sort of everyday life of American politics and outside of Washington too, is something I would never have expected in 2008. And if I'd been told that, you would get this kind of bad-temperedness and sort of toxic suspicion, mutual suspicion, I would have been pretty startled. The language that people use of opponents being enemies rather than opponents is not a healthy sign for democracy. There have been polls which accord with my anecdotal sort of experience in the last few months. There have been polls showing that that both Democrats and Republicans would see a victory for the opposing candidate as coming as a result of cheating or fraud. It would be illegitimate. Now, I think the Democrats have a lot more reason to suspect that in reality than Republicans do. I mean, considerably more reason. But it's a bad sign for democracy when trust has gone. It's something I've said before, and others have too, which is that fear is the glue of autocracy, and trust is the lubricant of democracy. Without trust, you're in trouble, and that's, I guess, the sort of principal feeling I have from this election is this is being conducted with very little trust and, at least on one side, no good faith whatsoever.
Are you ready to warrant a prediction about the outcome?
I think Biden will win reasonably big on a free and fair count of the votes. I mean reasonably big by today's standards, not by historic standards. This is not going to be a Walter Mondale, Ronald Reagan margin. This is going to be more like, 47, 52, 46, 53 kind of victory for Biden. What I can't predict is what Trump will do with the narrower margins in some of the swing states, because he signaled very clearly that, if he gets within what I would call cheating distance, he will use that leverage and flood the zone with nuisance legal claims, try to stop the counting of mailed-in ballots, and potentially send paramilitaries to some of the counting stations. So I'm not entirely confident that a Biden victory will avoid a constitutional crisis. I think you could have both, and it could go up until January. I am hopeful that the margin will be large enough that Trump isn't within cheating distance. But that's a much narrower call. And like many people from 2016, I am once bitten, twice shy.
Just to wrap up, you recently wrote that about the existential nature of this election. Americans increasingly see this as an all or nothing contest, and it I wonder if that has to do with what you just mentioned, this trauma of 2016 in terms of the shock of Trump's victory, but also this sense of the vulnerability of the American electoral system to manipulation. Do you think the U.S. can turn the page on that trauma? Do you think that these kinds of divisions and mutual suspicions and animosities, if not to some Pollyannish degree, just erased and evaporated, but do you think that politics can return to a more normal type of politics that existed before 2016?
I very much doubt it, because I think what you're going to see is Biden being blocked at every point, whatever he's trying to do, even the most reasonable basic things for all Americans about flattening the curve, he'll be blocked on by the Republican Party. And we will see the Supreme Court now 6-3 conservative Supreme Court plus the appeals courts voting down, shooting down various elements of what Biden's trying to do, as well as undoing some of the sort of gains of the last 50 years in terms of social progress. This will then heighten focus on the skewed malapportionment of the Senate, of the Electoral College, and of a constitutional voting system that benefits increasingly white, conservative, rural states at the expense of the increasingly urban, multicultural states. And that unfairness is incredibly hard to redress. It's just impossible to imagine a constitutional amendment passing both chambers and 3/4 of America's states. So I think the tension sort of built in to a system that's really an affirmative action for white small state voters, the tensions there are going to be something that Biden hits against, runs into very quickly into his administration if he wins. And that tension is going to get worse over time. So I don't know how you get out of that.
It's not a particularly hopeful note to end the interview on, Ed, but you got to call it like you see it. And I want to thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
If you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can subscribe to it on the podcast app of your choice, and you can also find links to do so at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Trendlines is edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.